Have you ever felt invisible? Not in the sense of being forgotten, but as if you were standing in the middle of your own family and suddenly realized that to them you had simply ceased to exist. I witnessed a silence that was louder than any scream the moment Constance Albright's life, an 82-year-old matriarch, was split in two. And what I discovered is that, for a grandmother, the worst pain isn't loneliness, but the certainty that her family has left her alone without even realizing it. Imagine a Sunday dinner, the smell of food, the laughter of grandchildren. But for Constance, that was the sound of her own absence. Today, I'm going to show you how a simple, mistakenly closed pantry door revealed the cruelest truth about her family, and how the silence of one night forced her to face a terrifying fact. She had disappeared to them a long time ago. You will learn to recognize the signs that you are becoming invisible before it's too late. Every second matters, because ignoring this lesson could cost you the connections you cherish most. Stay with me until the end to discover what Constance did after her family's last laugh faded, and what was written in that final letter, a secret that proved that sometimes the only way to be seen is to disappear completely. I was 82 the night it happened. My name is Constance Albright, and I've lived in the same Victorian house on the coast of Maine for more than half my life. People in town know me as Mrs. Albright from the high school, because I taught history there for 37 years. Since Henry passed 5 years ago, I've kept to a steady rhythm: gardening in the mornings, crosswords after lunch, family dinners on Sundays. Those dinners were my anchor, the thing that reminded me I still had a place in the swirl of my daughters' and grandchildren's lives. Or so I thought. It was early November, the kind of Sunday evening when the air carries that salty dampness in from the harbor. The house was warm, the roast beef was resting, and the mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier. My daughters, Anne and Lydia, arrived with their families' jackets flung on the coat rack, voices rising up the stairs before they even reached the dining room. I'd set everything just so, the silver polished, the napkins folded into little fans, the heirloom gravy boat in the center. I suppose part of me hoped they'd notice the care I took, though lately I'd started to feel like the wallpaper there, but overlooked. Meal itself was the usual chaos. The grandchildren bickered over who got the end slice of beef. My sons-in-law talked football, their voices filling the room like a running commentary. Every now and then I'd try to join a conversation, but my words would get swallowed in the noise. I smiled anyway, the way you do when you don't want to sour the air. I've learned that being the steady one means absorbing little cuts without showing the bruise. After dessert, I went to fetch a platter from the pantry, a wide, cream-colored piece with a faint blue border that had belonged to my grandmother. The pantry is a narrow, dark space off the kitchen, with an old oak door that swells in the damp and a latch you have to jiggle. I stepped inside, found the platter on the top shelf, and heard the shuffle of feet outside. Then slam. The sound startled me, and the latch clicked shut. At first, I chuckled. The door has stuck before. Usually someone opens it right away. I called out lightly, "Just a moment? Help me with this door." But my voice barely made it past the thick wood. I could hear them still laughter, clinking plates, the scrape of chairs, but no reply. I called again, louder this time, pressing my ear to the door. The smell of cinnamon from the apple pie lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of stored onions and old wood. Minutes passed. I told myself they'd realize soon enough. I imagined it asking, "Where's Mom?" and Lydia replying, "Probably in the pantry," followed by the door opening and everyone laughing. But the sounds on the other side grew fainter. Shifting from dinner bustle to the muffled tone of coats being put on, car keys jingling. My stomach tightened. I knocked harder. My knuckles stung from the solid wood. The engine of a car started outside, then another. The front door closed. Silence pooled around me like cold water. I stood there in the dim light from the single bulb overhead, the platter heavy in my hands, my breath suddenly loud in my ears. A strange thought came to me. Uninvited. They haven't noticed. Not just tonight, for a long time now. I leaned against the wall, feeling the chill from the outer wall seep through my sweater. It was more than being stuck in a pantry. It was the shape of something I'd been feeling for years, slipping further from the center of their lives, becoming a room they passed through without stopping. And now, here I was, quite literally shut away, while they carried on without me. I don't know how long I stood there before I sat down on the little wooden stool in the corner. The platter rested on my lap like some absurd trophy for endurance. My knees ached from standing, but what ached more was the creeping realization that this wasn't going to be over in a few minutes. I could picture them now, cars winding down the hill, headlights flashing briefly through the lace curtains in the front parlor. Each one carrying a piece of my family away into the night, none of them a werewolf, perhaps, caring enough to wonder where I'd gone. The thought made my throat tighten in a way that wasn't from the cool air. I tried to reason with myself. They'd been distracted, the kids were tired. Maybe they assumed I'd gone upstairs to rest. But as I turned those possibilities over, I felt an old, unwelcome truth brushing against me like a coat you've been trying to ignore in the back of the closet. This wasn't just one evening's oversight. I'd been fading from their notice for years, reduced to the woman who hosted and fed them, whose stories were half listened to, whose chair was left empty in group photos, because we'll take another with you in it later. That later never came. At some point, I stopped calling out. The sound of my own voice felt foolish, desperate, like a child trying to get the attention of someone who has already walked too far ahead to hear. Instead, I listened to the ticking of the small clock I keep in the pantry, its face stained with a splash of cranberry sauce from last Thanksgiving. Each tick felt heavier, louder, as though marking not just the minutes I was stuck there, but the years I'd been quietly locking myself away so as not to be a bother. The dark corners of the pantry seemed to close in the longer I sat there. There were jars of preserves on the shelves, peach, strawberry, and blackberry each, neatly labeled in my handwriting. My hands had done that work. My hands had kneaded bread, washed linens, ironed dresses, planted bulbs that bloomed in their yards, and yet, tonight, those same hands held a platter no one would notice missing. I traced the blue border with my fingertip, remembering my grandmother's kitchen, her bustling presence, the way no one would have ever forgotten she was in the room. Hours passed, or maybe it was only one, but it felt like a slow erasure. My legs were stiff when I finally tried standing again, just to pace the few steps the pantry allowed. I thought of Henry then, how he'd never left a room without knowing where I was. He used to say my presence grounded him, kept him from floating off into foolishness. That kind of attention felt like a relic from another life, and the absence of it now hollowed out my chest in a way the cold couldn't. Eventually, the silence outside became complete. No footsteps on the porch, no clink of dishes, no distant engines. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen beyond the door. I realized then that even if they noticed my absence later when they got home, perhaps it would be too late to undo the sting of this night. You can't unforget someone in a single phone call or apology. The forgetting has roots, and those roots had been creeping through the soil of our family for years. When I finally sat back down, I rested the platter against the wall and folded my hands in my lap. There was no anger left in me, only a kind of numb resignation. This was not a crisis in the way other people might think. A door stuck, an old woman trapped. This was the quiet confirmation of something I'd been trying not to name. I was no longer essential to them. I was the pantry itself, still there, still holding what they needed, but unseen until they wanted something from me. By the time my eyes grew heavy, I stopped imagining rescue. I leaned back against the cool wall, listening to the sound of my own breathing, and thought about the simplest, cruelest truth of aging. Sometimes the world doesn't push you out, it just closes the door and goes on without you. And by the time it thinks to open it again, you're not the same person who walked in. I woke to a thin strip of light creeping under the pantry door, the kind of pale, watery glow you only get in coastal Maine mornings. My back ached from the awkward angle I'd slept in, my neck stiff as though I'd been holding it against the cold. For a moment, I forgot where I was, reaching for the quilt Henry and I used to keep folded at the foot of the bed. Then the smell of dried herbs and stored potatoes brought me back. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, and felt the heaviness settle in again, not from the night in the pantry, but from knowing no one had come back. The sound that broke the silence was the crunch of boots on frost. It was Samuel, my gardener, his whistle faint at first, and then clearer as he passed the kitchen window. I called out, my voice raspy, and after a moment, the door latch rattled. His weathered face appeared in the crack as he swung it open, eyes wide. "Mrs. Albright, what on earth?" I smiled weakly, brushing crumbs from my skirt, and said the simplest thing I could manage. The door stuck. He didn't press me. He just helped me to the kitchen table and poured me a glass of water, the steam from his breath mixing with the faint chill still clinging to my skin. Once he left, the house felt cavernous. Every room seemed to echo, as though the laughter from last night had been scrubbed away, leaving only the outlines of where people had sat. My teacup from the evening before was still on the sideboard, a thin ring of brown marking where it had cooled untouched. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, the porcelain cold against my palm. I thought about making breakfast, but the thought of eating alone in that kitchen made me feel even more like the afterthought I had become. It was mid-morning when the phone rang. Anne's voice was bright at first, then faltered when I told her where I'd spent the night. "Oh, Mom, we didn't. We thought you'd gone to bed early. We're so sorry." I heard shuffling in the background, the muffled voice of Lydia saying something I couldn't catch. Promises followed about paying more attention, about not letting it happen again. I listened, said I understand, and meant it in a way they couldn't hear. Understanding isn't forgiveness. Sometimes it's just accepting that a thing is exactly what it appears to be. After the call, I went to the front parlor and stood by the mantelpiece. The photograph of Henry was there, the one from our 50th anniversary, he, in his navy suit, me in a cream dress, his hand resting lightly on my back. The sight of it steadied me. I took a sheet of stationery from my writing desk and began to write. My pen moved without hesitation, the words spilling out not in anger but in a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wrote about the dinners, about the laughter, about how I loved them all fiercely and without condition. And I wrote about the silence, about how it had been growing for so long I'd almost stopped noticing it until last night, made it impossible to ignore. The letter wasn't long, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. When I finished, I folded it neatly and placed it on the mantel beside Henry's picture. I traced the edge of the frame and felt a slip of paper hidden at the back. Curious, I eased it out. It was a note in Henry's handwriting, faded but still legible. "Don't ever forget to love her, because one day she won't be there to love you back." My breath caught. I held it for a long moment, the paper warm from my fingers, and felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I went to the coat closet and took down my old wool coat, the one with the deep pockets that could hide my hands entirely. No suitcase, no plans, just the coat, my keys, and the sense that something had quietly closed inside me. I looked around the house one last time, the chairs still pulled back from the table, a child's mitten left on the radiator, the smell of last night's roast lingering in the air. All the signs of life, but none of them mine anymore. When I stepped out the back door, the cold air was sharp enough to make me inhale hard. The town was waking up, gulls circling over the harbor, the sound of a distant foghorn. I pulled the coat tighter around me and walked down the narrow path between the hedges, not looking back. The silence I carried with me was heavier than the night in the pantry, but for the first time in years, it felt like it belonged. To me, the morning streets were still damp from the night's frost, each cobblestone slick and shining in the early light. I walked slowly, my steps echoing faintly against the storefronts that hadn't yet opened. The bakery's windows were fogged from the ovens inside, and the smell of fresh bread wafted out in warm bursts each time the door swung open for an early customer. I didn't go in. I didn't want small talk or questions about why I was out so early. I wanted to move unseen, just another figure wrapped in a coat, blending into the rhythm of the waking town. Passing the harbor, I stopped for a moment to watch the fishing boats bob in the water, their masts creaking like old bones. The gulls swooped low, crying out as they circled for scraps, their wings catching the thin sunlight. Henry and I used to come here on Sunday mornings, long before the family dinners became a tradition. We'd sit on the bench by the pier, share a paper bag of cinnamon donuts, and talk about the week ahead. Now the bench was empty, except for a scattering of leaves that shivered in the breeze. The sight of it was almost enough to turn me back home, but the memory of that pantry door clicking shut pushed me forward. I took the long way around town, past the library where I used to bring my students for research projects, and the small antique shop that still displayed the same silver tea set I'd admired for years. Each familiar landmark felt like a thread connecting me to a life I'd slowly been watching slip away. I realized I could follow those threads backward forever, retracing every step I'd taken here, or I could finally let some of them go. The idea was both terrifying and strangely freeing. When I reached the edge of town, the sidewalk narrowed and gave way to a dirt path that wound along the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly, its surface dark and restless under the morning sky. I stood at the edge, the wind tugging at my coat, and felt the salt spray on my face. Struck me then that I didn't need a destination. I only needed distance from the empty chairs, the untouched teacups. The sound of my voice disappearing into a room that didn't hear it. I sat on a flat rock overlooking the water and took Henry's note from my pocket. The paper was already soft from being handled so much, the edges curling slightly. I read it again, each word pressing deeper than before. He had known, somehow, that this day might come, that there would be a moment when I'd have to decide whether to keep waiting for love to come back to me or to step away entirely. It wasn't a push, it was permission. By late morning, my hands were stiff from the cold, but I wasn't ready to go back. Instead, I turned inland, following a narrow road that led toward the neighboring village. I didn't know anyone there, which was part of the appeal. I could walk into a cafe, order a cup of tea, and be just an old woman passing through no history, no expectations. The anonymity felt like a blanket I could pull tight around me. When I finally found a small cafe tucked between two brick buildings, I went inside and chose a table by the window. The heat from the radiator thawed my fingers as I cupped them around the steaming mug the waitress brought. Outside, people bustled past, carrying paper bags, walking dogs, calling to one another across the street. It was life, busy and loud, but none of it required anything from me. For the first time in years, I could simply watch without feeling like I was fading in plain sight. As I sat there, I realized that whatever came next didn't have to be decided today. I could take one morning, one afternoon, just to exist on my own terms. Maybe I'd go back eventually, maybe I wouldn't. But I knew this much. The door that had closed on me in the pantry had also opened something else, something that had nothing to do with my family, and everything to do with finding my own place again, even if it was far from the one I'd been holding together all these years. After finishing my tea, I stayed by the window longer than I needed to, tracing the rim of the mug with my fingertip. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a streak of blue in her hair, passed by and offered a small smile, the kind you give without expecting one back. I returned it, surprised at how much it warmed me. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me without the filter of family roles or expectations, just as a person in front of them. I paid my bill, left a tip larger than necessary, and stepped back into the crisp midday air. The main street of the village was lined with small shops and old-fashioned stationery store. A shop selling handmade quilts and a narrow bookstore that smelled of dust and rain-soaked wood. I wandered into the bookstore, letting my fingers skim over the spines without really looking for anything. The man behind the counter didn't ask if I needed help. He just nodded politely, giving me space. I picked up a worn copy of a poetry collection by Emily Dickinson and read a few lines, feeling the words settle somewhere deep in me. I bought it without thinking twice. I spent the next hour walking without a plan, letting my feet decide where to go. I passed a public garden, its benches damp from the morning dew, and paused to watch a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, their teacher pointing out the last stubborn blooms of late autumn. Their voices were bright, their questions spilling over one another. I thought of my own students from years ago, the way they'd follow me eagerly through museum halls or down the aisles of the library. And for a moment, I felt the old rush of purpose I used to carry. By early afternoon, I found myself near the village pier. The air here was sharper, filled with the scent of fish and brine, but it was alive with movement, men unloading crates from small boats, gulls screaming overhead, the water slapping against the dock's wooden pilings. I sat on the edge, legs dangling, and let the rhythm of the harbor replace the hollow quiet that had been following me since last night. I realized I could sit here for hours and not feel lonely, because here I wasn't forgotten. I was simply part of the backdrop, the same as everyone else. Hunger eventually nudged me toward a small seafood shack with a faded red awning. I ordered a bowl of clam chowder and ate it slowly, savoring the warmth. Each spoonful felt grounding, like the food was reminding me I still had a body that deserved care. The man at the counter asked if I was visiting, and I told him something like that. He didn't pry, just nodded and refilled my water. It struck me how freeing it was to answer questions without weaving them into a family narrative, to let myself exist in pieces instead of the whole they were used to seeing. As the afternoon light began to fade, the wind picked up, rattling the signs along the street. I pulled my coat tighter and wandered back toward the cafe I'd visited earlier, thinking I might sit for a while before deciding where to spend the night. The truth was, I wasn't ready to return home, not yet. There was nothing urgent pulling me back, no one waiting at the door, no voice calling out to check if I'd eaten. The realization was bittersweet, but it also meant I could take my time. Inside the cafe, I ordered another tea and took a seat at a different table, one tucked into the corner where I could see both the street and the other patrons. There was a couple sharing a slice of pie, an older man reading the paper, and a young mother rocking her baby in a stroller. I watched them the way I used to observe strangers when Henry and I traveled, wondering about their lives. The small stories they carried, the moments that might stay with them long after this day. It made me think about the kind of stories I wanted left of me when I was gone. By the time I stepped outside again, night had settled over the village, the street lamps casting soft circles of light on the wet pavement. I walked toward a small inn I'd noticed earlier, its windows glowing warmly against the dark. Inside, the woman at the desk greeted me as though I'd stayed there before, her tone casual and welcoming. I took a single room with a view of the harbor, the key cold in my hand, and climbed the creaking staircase. When I closed the door behind me, the quiet that filled the room was mine alone, not the heavy silence of neglect, but the kind I could wrap around myself like a blanket. The room smelled faintly of lavender, as if someone had tucked a sachet into the dresser drawers long ago and forgotten it there. I set my coat over the back of a chair and stood by the window, looking out at the harbor below. The tide was coming in, the water shifting under the yellow glow of the dock lights. A few fishing boats were still out, their lanterns bobbing in the dark like fireflies on the water. I pressed my palm to the cold glass and let my thoughts settle into the rhythm of the waves, slow and deliberate, as if they were breathing with me. I unpacked nothing, there was nothing to unpack. My life was still sitting in that Victorian house by the coast, the same way it had for decades. But for the first time, I didn't feel tethered to it. The idea was strange, almost disorienting, like realizing you've been holding a rope so long, you'd forgotten you could let go. I sat on the bed, the quilt heavy and hand-stitched, and traced the uneven stitches with my fingertips. Someone's hands had made this, just as mine had made countless things over the years. And I wondered if theirs had ever ached from the effort, if they'd ever wondered who would notice. Downstairs, faint music drifted up from the lobby, a slow jazz tune playing from a small radio. I opened the window a crack and let the sound mix with the distant splash of waves. It reminded me of evenings with Henry, when we'd sit in the parlor with a record spinning, not talking much, just sharing space. Back then, silence had been companionable. Now, I was learning the difference between silence that holds you and silence that swallows you. I decided to write again, not to my family this time, but to myself. I pulled the small notepad from the desk and began jotting down things I'd noticed today. The warmth of the cafe mug, the smell of the bakery's bread, the soft weight of the quilt. It felt like collecting proof that I still existed outside of being a mother, a grandmother, a host. Every detail was a reminder that I had a self beyond the roles I'd been filling, and that self was still here, even if my family had stopped seeing it. When I grew tired, I lay back and left the lamp on, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling as the wind rattled the window frame. My mind wandered through the pantry again, the fear of being stuck, but the sharp clarity of realizing I'd been living in a smaller and smaller space in their lives without protest. It wasn't that I wanted to punish them. I just couldn't keep waiting in that space for someone to notice the door was closed. Sleep came slowly, pulling me under in waves. I dreamed of walking through my own house as if it were a museum, each room roped off, the things I'd loved, preserved, but unreachable. In the dream, I wasn't sad, I was simply an observer, moving quietly past what I'd once called mine. When I woke, the image stayed with me, settling into a quiet conviction. I didn't have to return to a life that had turned me into a display. The morning light spilled across the harbor, pale gold on the water. I dressed simply, pulling my hair back the way I used to when teaching, and went downstairs for breakfast. The innkeeper served me a plate of eggs and toast, and we talked about the weather, the way small towns change over the years. She didn't ask why I was there, and I didn't offer. There was a comfort in leaving some things unsaid. As I ate, I thought about the day ahead. I could walk back home, arrive before lunch, and slip into the familiar Sunday routine as though nothing had happened. Or I could take the path inland again, find another village, another quiet room where no one expected me to fill a role. I didn't know yet which I would choose, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whichever door I walked through next, it would be because I chose it, not because it was the only one left open. After breakfast, I stepped outside with no fixed destination, the chill of the morning biting gently at my cheeks. The village was busier than the day before, shops opening their doors, delivery trucks idling at the curb, and the sound of church bells carrying across the harbor. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of the place seep into me. It was comforting to be somewhere that had its own life entirely separate from mine, where I could be an observer without any expectations attached to my presence. I passed a small real estate office with old-fashioned window displays, photographs of cottages, handwritten price tags tucked into the corners of the frames. Most were well beyond what I'd consider, but one picture caught my eye. A modest one-story home with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. The kind of place that looked like it had stories, but didn't demand too much of you. I stood there longer than I meant to, imagining myself sitting on that porch with a book, listening to the ocean in the distance. For the first time in a long while, the picture I formed in my mind didn't have my family in it. Further down the street, I found a small general store and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of cedar and coffee grounds. I bought a notebook and a pen, thinking I'd keep recording these days as they unfolded. The man at the register rang me up without small talk, which suited me fine. I wanted the quiet, the space to hear my own thoughts without interruption. Outside, I tucked the notebook into my coat pocket, feeling its solid shape. Against my hip, a small anchor for whatever might come next. By midday, I'd walked to the edge of the village and followed a trail that wound along the bluffs. The path was narrow, lined with hardy grasses that bent under the wind. From up here, the ocean stretched endlessly, the horizon blurred into a pale winter sky. I sat on a weathered bench halfway along the trail and opened my new notebook. My handwriting was a little shakier than it used to be, but it felt good to see my words take shape. On the page, I wrote about the pantry, about the cold latch under my fingers, about the realization that had been waiting for me in the dark. The more I wrote, the more certain I became that I wasn't ready to return not yet. When I reached the end of the trail, I found myself in another small hamlet really, just a cluster of houses and a single diner, with a neon open sign flickering in the window. I went inside and ordered a cup of tea. The waitress poured it without asking questions, sliding a small dish of lemon slices toward me. I liked that about these places. They didn't need your history to treat you kindly. As I sipped, I considered how easy it would be to disappear here, to blend into the quiet rhythm of a town that didn't know my name. The thought of my family surfaced now and then, like driftwood on the tide. I wondered if they'd gone by the house yet, if they'd found my letter, if they were worried, or if they were simply telling themselves I'd taken a few days to cool off. Part of me hoped they understood the depth of what had happened, but another part feared they'd see it only as an overreaction, a blip in the steady role I'd always played. I pushed the thought aside. Today wasn't about them. It was about me deciding what kind of life I could build from this point on. By late afternoon, I'd circled back to the inn. The harbor was quiet, the water darkening as the sun dipped low. I stopped at a small bakery near the pier and bought a loaf of crusty bread, still warm in its paper bag. Back in my room, I tore off a piece and ate it plain, the soft crumbs still steaming. It felt grounding to care for myself in these small ways, to choose what I wanted without consulting anyone else. That night, I wrote again, this time not just about the past, but about possibilities. I made a list of places I'd like to see, even if they were only a few towns away. I wrote down what I'd need if I didn't go back home right away, and what I'd take with me if I returned only. To pack it was the first time in years that I'd made a plan entirely for myself. As I set the notebook down, I realized something important. The pantry had been a prison for one night. But it had also been a door, and I'd stepped through it into a life I was finally willing to imagine. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, the room still dim except for a pale band of light seeping around the curtains. I dressed without hurry, pulling on the same wool coat and slipping my notebook into the pocket downstairs. The innkeeper greeted me with a simple good morning, and I took my breakfast at a small table by the window. Outside, the tide was low, revealing the muddy flats where gulls picked at the sand. I felt an unexpected calm, no rush to be anywhere, no list of chores waiting, no table to set for a family meal. After breakfast, I walked to the bus stop at the edge of the village. A small timetable posted under the shelter showed routes to neighboring towns. My finger traced the map, stopping at a name I'd never visited before, fishing community about 30 miles south. The bus arrived with a groan of brakes, and I climbed aboard, paying the fare in cash. The driver didn't ask where I was coming from. He just nodded toward the empty seats. I chose one by the window and watched the coastline slide by, the ocean flashing silver between stretches of pine forest. The ride took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into another chapter. The new town was livelier, with a working dock full of stacked lobster traps and the smell of salt and diesel in the air. I walked along the waterfront, noting the small inns, the general store, and a row of weathered cottages set back from the road. A for rent sign caught my eye, 2 rooms above a bait shop, the paint peeling but the porch overlooking the harbor. I didn't go inside, but I lingered long enough to imagine the light that must flood those rooms in the morning. By midday, I found a cafe tucked between 2 bait suppliers, its front window lined with potted geraniums. Inside, the tables were mismatched, the air scented with coffee and fried haddock. I ordered a sandwich and settled at a corner table, pulling out my notebook. I wrote about the bus ride, the smell of the ocean, the sight of those empty rooms above the bait shop. I didn't yet know if I'd rent them, but I wanted to hold on to the idea. Ideas like that felt fragile now, easily lost if I didn't catch them on paper. In the afternoon, I walked further inland, where the streets grew quieter and the houses sat behind low stone walls. Children played in a yard, their shouts carrying on the wind. An elderly man was raking leaves into neat piles, and when I passed, he looked up and said, "Good day to you." The words were simple, but they landed differently than any greeting I'd had in months. It wasn't perfunctory, it was the acknowledgement of one person to another, without the invisible weight of expectation between us. I returned to the harbor before sunset, the air cooling quickly as the light thinned. The fishing boats came in one by one, their decks wet and glistening. Crews moving with the practiced rhythm of people who've done the same work for years. I stood on the pier watching them tie up, the slap of rope against wood echoing in the stillness. This was a place that didn't need me, and somehow that made me feel more present than I had in my own home for a long time. As darkness settled, I took the last bus back to the village where I'd been staying. The ride was quiet, the only light coming from the dashboard and the occasional glow of a house set back from the road. When I stepped off, the inn's windows glowed warmly against the cold. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cinnamon, and I realized I'd been looking forward to that scent without knowing it. I climbed the stairs to my room, bread from the bakery under my arm, and felt something close to contentment. That night, I sat at the desk and reread my entries from the past 2 days. The words were uneven, sometimes halting, but they told a truth I couldn't ignore. I was building a picture of a life apart from the one I'd been living. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in quiet recognition that I still had choices. I closed the notebook, placed it by the bed, and thought about how strange it was that the smallest room in my house had led me to something that felt this vast. On the third morning, I awoke before the sun, the room still cloaked in the soft gray of pre-dawn. I lay there, listening to the occasional creak of the old building and the faint hum of the radiator. My mind was already turning over the same thought I'd been circling since yesterday. What if I didn't go back, at least not right away? The idea no longer felt reckless, it felt like a real possibility, something I could plan for instead of just daydream about. I sat up slowly, pulled on my slippers, and made tea with the small kettle the innkeeper had left in the room. After breakfast, I walked to the village library. It was housed in a converted church, the high ceilings crisscrossed with beams and the faint scent of old paper lingering in the air. I asked the librarian if they had local newspapers, and she led me to a table stacked with them. I flipped through the classifieds, marking any mention of rentals or small cottages for sale. Most were too far inland for my liking, but a few caught my eye, places with porches, with gardens that could be coaxed back to life. I jotted them down in my notebook, noting addresses and phone numbers. From the library, I wandered to the post office. I bought a sheet of stamps, thinking I might send a postcard to my grandchildren, not to explain myself, but simply to let them know I was somewhere thinking of them. I chose one with a watercolor of the coastline, addressed it carefully, and wrote a short message. Saw this, and thought of you. Be kind to each other. I didn't sign it, Grandma, just my name. It felt different, that way more personal, somehow. By midday, I found myself back at the harbor, watching the tide come in. I sat on a bench and made a list in my notebook of what I'd need if I stayed away longer. A few changes of clothes, my sewing kit, my gardening gloves, Henry's photograph. The list was short, which surprised me. I realized how little I truly needed, how much of my home was filled with things that were only there because they had always been there. The thought didn't make me sad, it made me feel lighter. Later in the afternoon, I walked to the small grocery store and picked up a few essentials: milk, tea, a jar of strawberry jam. Carrying the bag back to the inn felt oddly satisfying, like I was settling into a rhythm that belonged only to me. In the lobby, the innkeeper asked if I'd be staying another night. I hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Yes, please." She smiled as if she'd been expecting my answer. Up in my room, I spread the groceries on the small table and made a cup of tea. I ate a slice of bread with jam, savoring the simplicity of it. My thoughts drifted back to the pantry, the cold wood of the door against my hands, the sound of my family's voices fading away. That moment had felt like the closing of something permanent. But now I wondered if it had also been the opening of something I hadn't been ready to see. As the sun set, I called the number for one of the rentals I'd seen in the paper, a small cottage 2 towns over, available immediately. The voice on the other end was warm, telling me it was furnished and that the previous tenant had kept the garden in good shape. We arranged for me to see it in 2 days. When I hung up, I felt a flutter in my chest that was equal parts nerves and anticipation. That night, I sat at the desk and wrote for a long time. I didn't write to my family, and I didn't write to myself. I wrote to Henry, telling him about the village, the harbor, the cottage I might visit. I told him I was learning how to be alone in a way that didn't feel like loneliness. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it into the back of my notebook. It wasn't a letter meant to be sent, it was one meant to be kept. A reminder of why I'd stepped out into the cold that night and kept walking. 2 days later, I boarded the morning bus with a small paper bag carrying a thermos of tea and my notebook. The ride was quiet, the road winding along the coast with flashes of sunlight glinting off the water. When the driver called out my stop, I stepped down onto a narrow lane lined with pines. The air smelled fresher here, sharper, as if the wind had come straight across the ocean without touching land. I could see the cottage from the road, a modest structure, with weathered shingles and a porch railing just slightly askew. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, met me at the gate. She wore a red wool sweater and had the kind of face that suggested she spent a lot of time outdoors, her cheeks ruddy and eyes quick to smile. "It's nothing fancy," she said as she unlocked the door, "but it's solid, and it's quiet." Inside, the rooms were small but full of light. The living room had 2 mismatched chairs angled toward a stone fireplace, and the kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish. There were no grand features, but there was a warmth to it, the kind that came from being lived in with care. We walked through the garden together, which even in winter held signs of someone's affection: raised beds neatly covered, a few stubborn herbs still clinging to green. I imagined myself here in spring, hands in the soil, coaxing life back into the beds. It wasn't a grand vision, but it was mine. Margaret noticed the way I looked at the garden and said, "The last tenant grew tomatoes right up until October." Her voice carried an unspoken message. This was a place that could be yours if you wanted it. Back inside, I sat in one of the living room chairs while Margaret made us tea. The steam rose between us, and she asked nothing about my life beyond whether I liked the area. I appreciated that. We talked about the tides, the seasonal markets, the way the light hit the water in late afternoon. I realized I could have this kind of conversation every day, hear about what was in front of us, not about what was missing or what had gone wrong. When she handed me the cup, I wrapped my hands around it and asked the question I'd been circling. If I decided today, when could I move in? She didn't hesitate. Anytime. It's ready. The ease of her answer caught me off guard. I'd expected some complication, some obstacle to delay the decision, but here it was simple, immediate, possible. I told her I needed to think for a day, but in truth, the image of myself unlocking this door was already lodged in my mind. The walk back to the bus stop felt different than the walk in. I noticed details I'd missed before: the way the pine needles softened the sound of my steps, the curve of the lane as it dipped toward the sea, the small mailbox with a faded bluebird painted on the side. Everything seemed to be telling me that a life here could be quiet without being empty, solitary without being lonely. On the ride back, I opened my notebook and wrote down every detail I could remember about the cottage. I didn't want to lose the way it had felt to stand in those rooms, to see the light slant through the kitchen window, to imagine my teacup on that small wooden table. By the time the bus rolled back into the village where I'd been staying, my mind was already arranging the steps it would take to make the move. That evening, back in my room at the inn, I spread my notebook on the bed and began making 2 lists, one for what I'd need to bring from the house and one for what I would leave behind. The second list grew longer than the first. There was a strange relief in letting go, in realizing I could step into a new place carrying only what mattered most. When I put down my pen, I knew that tomorrow I would call Margaret and tell her yes. The next morning, I sat at the small desk in my room, the phone resting in front of me like a final test. I dialed Margaret's number and listened to the steady hum of the line. When she answered, her voice was warm, as though she'd been expecting my call. "I'll take it," I said simply. There was a pause, one of those pauses that isn't hesitation, just the quiet of something settling into place. "Good," she replied. "I'll have the key ready for you." We agreed I would move in at the end of the week. Hanging up, I felt a flicker of anticipation ripple through me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. The rest of the morning, I planned my trip back to the Victorian house. It would be brief, purposeful. No lingering in the rooms, no getting pulled into the gravity of old routines. I would take what I needed: clothes, my gardening tools, Henry's photograph, a few books, the worn quilt from my bed. Everything else could stay. The decision wasn't cruel, it was necessary. I didn't want to pack the weight of a life that had already been shrinking around me. I walked to the general store to buy a sturdy canvas bag and a small lockbox for important papers. The shopkeeper, a man I'd seen before but never spoken to, asked if I was getting organized. I smiled faintly and said, something like that. It struck me how freeing it felt to give an answer without explaining the whole truth. My story was mine to tell when and if I wanted. Back at the inn, I opened my notebook and wrote a list of the exact rooms I would enter when I returned, nothing more. The pantry was not on the list. I wasn't sure I could bring myself to open that door again. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I imagined myself walking through the house like a guest, moving from one destination to the next, and leaving without the house noticing I'd been there at all. That night, I called Anne. I didn't tell her about the cottage. I simply said I'd be coming by in a few days to gather some things. She sounded relieved, perhaps thinking it meant I was ready to come home. I let her think that. There was no point in trying to explain something she wasn't ready to hear. Some truths have to be lived to be understood, and I doubted she'd ever lived the kind of quiet I had in that pantry. In the days before my trip back, I spent my time walking along the harbor, memorizing the way the light shifted across the water. The smell of the salt air, the sound of gulls cutting through the wind. I wanted to carry these things with me when I returned to the Victorian house, like a shield against the pull of the life I was leaving behind. When the morning came, I boarded the bus with my empty canvas bag folded neatly in my lap. The closer we got to my town, the more I felt the old weight settle on my shoulders, the familiarity of the streets, the curve of the road leading to my gate. It was like walking into a photograph, everything exactly as I'd left it, but drained of any warmth. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the air cool and still. I moved quickly, just as I'd planned. Upstairs to the bedroom for the quilt, the photograph, and my clothes, down to the study for the papers and a few books. I didn't linger in the dining room, didn't glance toward the pantry. When I zipped the canvas bag closed, it was light enough to carry in one hand. That was all I needed to know that my life now could fit into something I could hold. I locked the front door with a steady hand, the key turning smoothly in the old brass lock. For a moment, I stood on the porch, canvas bag at my side, and let my eyes drift over the facade of the Victorian house. The paint was beginning to peel along the eaves. The porch steps sagged just slightly in the middle, and the lace curtains in the parlor window swayed faintly with the draft. It looked exactly as it had for years, but to me it no longer felt like mine. The connection had thinned to a thread, and now I was letting that thread go. Walking down the path to the gate, I noticed small details I'd stopped seeing long ago. The crack in the stone walkway where weeds pushed through, the rust beginning to form on the wrought iron latch. They were signs of neglect, but not the kind that came from malice. Neglect that comes from assuming something will always be there, that it will keep holding together without anyone tending to it. That was me. I thought that had been me for years. At the bus stop, I sat on the wooden bench and placed the bag beside me. A couple of neighbors passed by, one offering a polite nod, the other two focused on his phone to look up. I didn't wave. There was no point in marking this as a farewell. The life I'd lived here was already over in the ways that mattered. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and I climbed aboard without looking back at the house. Some goodbyes are better without ceremony. The ride to the new village felt shorter than it had before, as if the distance between the two places had shrunk now that I'd decided where I belonged. I watched the scenery past the bare trees etched against the winter sky, the frozen patches of marshland, the occasional flash of the ocean through breaks in the forest. With every mile, the air seemed to change, sharpening, clearing, like I was breathing more fully. When the bus pulled into the familiar stop, I stepped down onto the pavement and felt a quiet relief wash over me. The harbor smell reached me immediately, briny, alive. I adjusted the strap of my bag and started walking toward the cottage road, the sound of gulls overhead like a welcome I hadn't known I was waiting for. It wasn't home yet, but it was already closer to it than the house I'd left behind. Margaret was waiting at the gate when I arrived, key in hand. "Welcome," she said simply, and passed it to me. The metal was warm from her palm. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the light pooling across the wooden floorboards. My bag dropped easily onto the chair by the fireplace. In that moment, I felt the shift, not dramatic, but undeniable. I had crossed from the life I'd been holding together for others into one I could hold for myself. That first evening, I unpacked the few things I'd brought. The quilt spread over the bed, Henry's photograph placed on the mantel, the books lined neatly on the small shelf by the window. Each item found its place quickly, as if it had been waiting. I boiled water for tea, the steam fogging the glass as I looked out at the darkening harbor. The silence here was different, no longer a hollow absence, but a companion. Before bed, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. "I have stepped out of the pantry, and the door will not close behind me again." I set the notebook on the table and turned out the lamp, the room settling into a stillness that felt entirely mine. For the first time in a long time, I went to sleep without wondering if anyone would notice I was gone, because now I was exactly where I meant to be. The first morning in the cottage, I woke to the sound of gulls and the faint creak of the porch railing in the wind. Light poured in through the thin curtains, soft and golden, touching the quilt in uneven patches. I made tea in the small kitchen, the kettle whistling more sharply than the one I'd used for decades. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and salt. For a long time, I just stood by the window, watching the tide pull away from the shore, and felt the quiet settle around me, not the suffocating kind, but the sort that makes space for you to breathe. I spent that day arranging the cottage the way I liked. The quilt over the bed, Henry's photo in the living room where the light hit it in late afternoon, my books stacked in a corner with a chair pulled close. In the garden, I cleared a patch of dead leaves and found green shoots hiding underneath. They felt like a small promise, waiting for spring. I realized that tending to this place would be nothing like maintaining the Victorian house. Here, each corner felt manageable, every task a choice instead of a duty. By the second evening, I had a routine forming. Morning tea on the porch, a walk into the village for bread or milk, an hour of writing in my notebook before dusk. I didn't keep a clock in sight. The light and the tides were enough to mark the hours. I could feel the tension I'd carried for years of schedules, of family expectations beginning to ease out of my shoulders. My life no longer revolved around anticipating the needs of others. On the third morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was Anne's, hurried and uneven. She wrote that they had found my note, that the house felt empty without me, that the children were asking when I'd be back. She didn't mention the pantry, but I could feel the edges of the truth pressing through her words. I read the letter twice, then set it aside, without answering. Not out of cruelty, but because I wasn't ready to let their urgency dictate my return. Instead, I walked into the village and mailed postcards to the grandchildren. Short notes about the gulls, the garden, the sound of the harbor at night. I didn't tell them exactly where I was, only that I was well and that I loved them. It felt important to send them pieces of myself that weren't filtered through their parents' voices. That afternoon, I invited Margaret over for tea. We sat on the porch with our cups, the steam curling into the crisp air. She told me about the history of the cottage, about the storms that had rattled these walls, about the people who had lived here before me. Listening to her, I felt myself becoming part of the story of this place, rather than a ghost lingering in someone else's narrative. In the evenings, I began lighting a small fire in the fireplace, the crackle filling the room with warmth. I'd sit in the mismatched chair by the window, Henry's photo on the mantel within sight, and read until my eyes grew heavy. These were not grand nights, but they were mine, shaped by my own hands and choices. The absence of my family was no longer an kit, was simply a space, and I was learning how to fill it. By the end of the first week, I knew I would not be going back to live in the Victorian house. It wasn't a decision made out of spite, but out of a quiet certainty that the woman I had been there was gone. Here, I was building something new, something that did not require me to disappear in order to keep it standing. A week later, another letter came, this time from Lydia. Her tone was different from Anne's. She didn't plead for my return. She asked if we could meet somewhere neutral for lunch. She wrote that she wanted to understand, not to convince. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my notebook. I wasn't ready to answer, but I felt a small shift, knowing that at least one of them was starting to see this wasn't about a single night or a locked door. It was about years of being slowly unseen. That evening, I walked down to the harbor as the sun sank into the horizon. The sky burned in shades of copper and deep violet, and the tide moved in with a steady hush. I thought about all the Sundays at the Victorian house, the noise, the laughter, the way I used to watch it from just outside the circle. Here, I wasn't outside anything. I was standing exactly where I chose, and the world kept its shape around me. I began writing longer in my notebook at night, sometimes filling 3 or 4 pages without stopping. These weren't records of my days, so much as small truths I'd been holding back for years, how it felt to be spoken over. To have my home treated as a backdrop, to realize no one noticed when I left the room. Putting it on paper didn't make the past hurt less, but it made it honest. And honesty felt like the clean air coming off the water. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by with a small bundle, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a hand-knit scarf in deep blue wool. "It gets colder here in January," she said, and left it at that. I ran my hands over the stitches, feeling the warmth woven into them. It reminded me of all the quiet acts of care I'd given over the years, so often unnoticed. This one, though, I would notice every time I wrapped it around my neck. By the second week, I received a phone call from Anne. She said the children missed me and asked if they could visit. I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it. I didn't want to shut the door on them entirely, but I also knew I couldn't let them come here expecting me to slide back into the role I'd always played. If they visited, it would be on new terms where I was present by choice, not by obligation. That night, sitting by the fire, I realized I hadn't thought about the pantry in days. The memory of it was still there, sharp and unshakable, but it no longer defined me. It had become the hinge on which my life had turned, nothing more. I closed my notebook and looked around the cottage at the way the firelight played on the walls, at the shadows of the garden moving outside the window. This was no longer a temporary shelter. It was home. I wrote one last letter, not to send, but to leave with my things in case someone needed to understand someday. I wrote that I loved my family, but I loved myself too, and I could no longer live in a place where my existence was taken for granted. I wrote that the silence here was different. It was chosen, not imposed. And I ended with Henry's note, copied in my own hand. "Don't ever forget to love her, because one day she won't be there to love you back." When I put down my pen, I felt no sadness, only a calm that reached all the way to my fingertips. I stepped out onto the porch, the air cold and clean, the harbor lights glimmering in the dark. Somewhere behind me, the life I'd lived for decades was still standing, unchanged in its outward form, but I was no longer inside it. I had walked out, locked the door behind me, and found a place where it would never close on me again. Winter settled in quickly along the coast. the mornings arriving with frost etching the edges of the cottage windows. I found myself embracing the rhythm of the days, walking to the market, bundled in Margaret's scarf, baking bread in the small oven, tending to the garden beds even when the soil was stiff with cold. My hands ached sometimes, but it was a satisfying ache, the kind that came from work done for myself. There was a quiet pride in looking around and knowing every small comfort here was something I'd chosen. Letters from my daughters came more regularly, though I didn't respond to all of them. Some were updates about the children, others were apologies written in careful words that still seemed to skirt the real wound. I read them without resentment, but also without urgency. I no longer felt the need to bridge the gap on my own. If they wanted to cross it, they would have to meet me in the middle, where I now stood. One afternoon, a postcard arrived from my eldest granddaughter. She had drawn a picture of a seagull in blue crayon and written in uneven letters, "Grandma, I miss you. Can I come see your new house?" I traced the drawing with my fingertip, feeling something loosened inside me. I decided then that when the weather warmed, I would invite her. Just her. I wanted her to see me here, not as the woman who waited in the kitchen for plates to be cleared, but as someone who had claimed her own space. In January, a storm rolled in from the sea, battering the harbor with waves that struck like fists against the dock. The wind howled through the cracks in the window frames, and I sat by the fire listening to the wildness outside. It made me think of that night in the pantry, the muffled sounds of my family on the other side of the door. The difference now was that I wasn't waiting for anyone to open it. I was exactly where I meant to be, and the storm could rage as it pleased. The cottage began to feel more like a second skin. I learned which floorboards creaked, which cupboard doors stuck in damp weather, which way to turn the key so it wouldn't catch. The garden, even in its winter sleep, seemed to recognize my touch, the soil softening slightly when I pressed my palm to it. These small details stitched me to the place in ways I hadn't felt in years. By late February, I realized I'd stopped counting the days since I'd left the Victorian house. Time here was measured in tides and weather changes, not in weeks or months. I had stopped glancing over my shoulder for signs of my old life. I didn't need to. It was no longer chasing me, and I was no longer chasing it. On the first truly warm day of March, I walked to the edge of the bluff and looked out at the sea. The air was sharp with salt, the horizon a clean line between blue water and pale sky. I thought about Henry, about the note he'd left behind the photo frame. I knew he would have understood this choice. He'd have seen it, not as running away, but as finally stepping toward something that was mine. That night, I wrote one final entry in my notebook. I was not locked away. I was waiting to turn the handle myself. And when I did, the door opened to a life that was still mine to live. I closed the book, set it on the table, and let the fire burn low. Outside, the harbor lights shimmered against the dark water, steady and unshaken, like a promise kept. If you've ever felt invisible to those you love, you know the silent weight that carries. Constance chose to step into a place where she could be seen not for what was expected of her, but for who she truly is. Her decision reminds us that dignity has no age, and sometimes we need to open doors within ourselves before we find the way back. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt that kind of silence, not from emptiness, but from neglect? How did you respond? Sharing stories like this can help light the path, both for those who tell them and those who listen. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone. If you want to hear more real stories of people facing life's hardships and finding strength to move forward, stay here with us. These stories are pieces of our shared humanity, and in sharing, we find comfort and courage to begin again. Thank you for staying until the end. Life isn't always easy, but every brave step, even the smallest deeds, an act of love for ourselves and for those who may stand by us someday if we choose to let them.